The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as David Williams pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway. His footsteps echoed softly in the quiet building, a sound he had grown accustomed to over the past 15 years. At 45, David had become as much a part of the courthouse as the brass fixtures and wooden benches he polished every day. David arrived at work every morning at 5:30 sharp, an hour before anyone else set foot in the building. He liked the peace of those early hours when the courthouse belonged to him alone. No rushing lawyers, no anxious defendants, no crowds of people, just him and the work. That had kept food on his family's table for over a decade and a half. He started his day the same way he always did, checking each courtroom to make sure everything was ready for the day ahead. David took pride in his work, though most people never noticed the effort he put in. The floors gleamed because he mopped them twice. The windows sparkled because he cleaned them inside and out. The trash was emptied, the furniture was dusted, and every detail was perfect. Most people who worked in the courthouse knew David by sight, but few bothered to learn his name. To them, he was simply the janitor, a quiet man who appeared when needed and disappeared when his work was done. They saw his uniform, his cart, and his tools, but they rarely saw him as a person with dreams, struggles, and a story worth knowing. What they didn't know was that David's day didn't end when he left the courthouse at 2 in the afternoon. While others went home to relax or spend time with family, David headed straight to his second job at a local office building. He worked there until 10 at night, cleaning offices and emptying trash bins for people who had already gone home to their comfortable lives, but even that wasn't the end of David's day. 3 nights a week, he would drive across town to the community college, where he sat in lecture halls alongside students young enough to be his children. While they worried about weekend plans and dating, David worried about whether he could stay awake long enough to absorb the complex legal concepts being discussed. David had been taking classes for 8 long years, 1 or 2 at a time, whenever he could afford the tuition and find the time. His wife, Patricia, often fell asleep on the couch waiting for him to come home from his evening classes. His teenage daughter, Angela, had grown used to doing her homework at the kitchen table while her father studied at the other end, both of them surrounded by books and papers. The other students in his classes didn't know that David worked 2 jobs to pay for his education. They didn't know that he sometimes fell asleep over his textbooks because he had been on his feet for 16 hours straight. They didn't know that every dollar he spent on books meant $1 less for family expenses, or that his wife had taken on extra shifts at the hospital, where she worked as a nurse to help support his dream. David had always been fascinated by the law. During his years at the courthouse, he had watched countless trials and heard hundreds of arguments. He had seen justice served and injustice ignored. He had watched powerful lawyers defend the wealthy while public defenders struggled with overwhelming caseloads. He had seen people who looked like him get harsher sentences than those who didn't, and he had seen the system work perfectly for some while failing others completely. It was during his 5th year working at the courthouse that David made a decision that would change his life forever. He was cleaning the law library late one evening when he found himself alone with thousands of legal books. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled one from the shelf. The language was complex and challenging, but something about it called to him. That night, David checked out his first law book from the public library. He read it slowly, looking up every word he didn't understand. It took him 3 months to finish, but when he did, he felt something he had never experienced before. A sense that he could actually understand this complicated world that surrounded him at work every day. His family thought he was crazy when he announced his intention to go to law school. His friends laughed and told him to be realistic. Even some of his co-workers at the courthouse made jokes about the janitor who thought he could become a lawyer. But David had made up his mind, and nothing could stop him. The hardest part wasn't the studying or the long hours. It was the way people looked at him when he told them about his goals. Some were supportive, but many others seemed to think he was reaching beyond his station in life. They would smile politely and change the subject, or make comments about how everyone needs dreams, even unrealistic ones. Officer Robert Thompson was one of those people who never bothered to learn David's name, despite testifying in the courthouse several times a month for the past 10 years. To Thompson, David was just part of the background, invisible help that kept the building running. Thompson had a habit of treating courthouse staff like they were beneath him, especially the cleaning crew and security guards. Thompson was a 20-year veteran of the police force with a reputation for being tough on crime and even tougher on anyone he considered inferior. He had received several complaints over the years for his treatment of suspects and witnesses, but his arrest record was good enough that his supervisors usually looked the other way. In Thompson's mind, the world was divided into two types of people, those who mattered and those who didn't. David had encountered Thompson dozens of times over the years, usually when the officer was waiting to testify or hanging around the courthouse between cases. Thompson had a way of looking right through David, as if he wasn't even there. When David was mopping floors, Thompson would walk across them without a second thought. When David was emptying trash, Thompson would toss his coffee cup in the direction of the bin, not caring if it made extra work, but David never complained. He understood that respect was something he would have to earn, not something he could demand. He also knew that his job was important, even if others didn't see it that way. The courthouse couldn't function without people like him, and he took pride in doing his part to keep the wheels of justice turning. As the years passed, David watched Thompson's behavior toward courthouse staff get worse. The officer seemed to take pleasure in making snide comments about people's intelligence or worth. He would make jokes about how some people were born to serve while others were born to lead. David heard these comments but never responded, focusing instead on his work and his studies. What Thompson didn't know was that David had been watching him too. During his years of cleaning the courthouse and attending law classes, David had developed a deep understanding of how the justice system was supposed to work versus how it actually worked. He had seen Thompson bend the truth in his testimony and watched judges who were too busy or too tired to challenge inconsistencies in police reports. David had also seen how Thompson treated defendants differently based on their race and economic status. He had watched the officer show respect to wealthy white defendants while speaking dismissively to poor defendants of color. These observations had only strengthened David's resolve to become a lawyer and fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Now, after 8 long years of studying, 2 jobs, and countless sacrifices, David was about to finish his journey. He had passed all his classes, completed his internship at a legal aid clinic, and was waiting for the results of the bar exam he had taken just 1 month ago. Soon, everything would change, but for now, he was still just the courthouse janitor that most people ignored. The courthouse was buzzing with activity that Tuesday morning as one of the biggest cases of the year was set to begin. The hallways were packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers who had come to witness what many expected to be a landmark trial. David had arrived extra early that day, knowing the building would be chaos. Once people started arriving, he had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect. The courtroom floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the wooden benches were polished to a shine, and every piece of trash had been removed. David took special care on days like this because he knew the courthouse would be under scrutiny, and he wanted everything to reflect well on the institution he had come to love despite its flaws. By 9 in the morning, courtroom 3A was packed to capacity. Judge Patricia Hernandez was presiding over a complex fraud case that had captured the public's attention for months. The defendant was a wealthy businessman accused of stealing millions from his investors, and the case had attracted media coverage from across the state. David was finishing up his morning cleaning routine when he noticed the crowd gathering outside the courtroom. He had learned over the years to stay out of the way during high-profile cases, but his job still required him to maintain the building throughout the day. He quietly pushed his cart to a corner near the courtroom entrance, planning to wait until the morning session was over before continuing his work in that area. Officer Thompson had arrived early as well, since he was scheduled to testify about the financial documents he had seized during the investigation. He was dressed in his best uniform and had spent extra time that morning making sure he looked professional for what he knew would be a career-defining moment. This case could make him look good in front of his supervisors and maybe even earn him a promotion. As people filed into the courtroom, Thompson stood in the hallway chatting with other officers and detectives involved in the case. He was in a good mood, joking around and talking loudly about how this case was going to put several corrupt businessmen behind bars where they belonged. He loved being the center of attention, especially when it made him look like a hero. The morning session went smoothly for the first 2 hours. Lawyers presented their opening arguments, witnesses were called to testify, and Thompson waited patiently for his turn to take the stand. During the first recess, people spilled out into the hallway to stretch their legs and grab coffee from the vending machines. David knew this was his chance to quickly empty the trash bins and wipe down the surfaces in the courtroom while people were outside. He had done this routine hundreds of times before and could work quickly and efficiently without disturbing anyone. He pushed his cart toward the courtroom entrance, keeping his head down and moving purposefully. Thompson was standing near the courtroom doors with a group of other officers when he noticed David approaching with his cleaning supplies. For some reason, the sight of the janitor irritated him. Maybe it was nerves about his upcoming testimony, or maybe it was just his usual attitude toward people he considered beneath him. But something about David's presence bothered him. "Well, well, well," Thompson said loudly, making sure his voice carried across the crowded hallway. "Look who's here. The courthouse cleanup crew is getting ready to work." David heard the comment but continued with his job, pulling a fresh trash bag from his cart and preparing to enter the courtroom. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle comments like this was to ignore them and focus on his work. Engaging with people like Thompson never ended well for someone in his position, but Thompson wasn't finished. He was enjoying the attention his comments were getting from the other officers and some of the lawyers standing nearby. A few people had turned to look, and Thompson felt emboldened by their attention. "I bet this guy doesn't even know what's going on in there," Thompson continued, gesturing toward the courtroom. "Probably thinks we're just having some kind of fancy meeting. Some people just aren't cut out for understanding complex things like legal proceedings." A few of the younger officers chuckled at Thompson's comments, but some of the more experienced law enforcement professionals looked uncomfortable. They had worked with David for years and knew him to be a respectful, hard-working man who minded his own business and did his job well. David felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he continued preparing to enter the courtroom. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before, and he knew that reacting would only make things worse. He pulled on his rubber gloves and gathered the cleaning supplies he would need. Thompson, however, was just getting started. The attention from the crowd was like a drug to him, and he wanted to keep the spotlight on himself. He looked around to make sure people were still listening, then raised his voice even louder. "I mean, look at this guy," Thompson said, pointing directly at David. "He's been pushing that same cart around this building for, 10 years? 15 years? And he's still doing the exact same job. That tells you something about a person's capabilities, doesn't it?" The hallway had grown quieter as more people began to notice what was happening. Some of the courthouse staff who knew and respected David looked shocked and angry at Thompson's behavior. A few lawyers shook their heads in disgust, but no one spoke up to defend David. David felt every eye in the hallway on him as he stood there with his cleaning cart. He could feel the weight of their stares and hear the whispered conversations starting around him. Part of him wanted to respond, to defend himself, to tell Thompson and everyone else exactly what he thought about their assumptions and prejudices, but David had worked too hard and come too far to throw it all away over a moment of anger. He thought about his wife Patricia, who had sacrificed so much to support his dream. He thought about his daughter Angela, who looked up to him and believed in his goals. He thought about all the late nights studying, all the money spent on books and tuition, all the exhaustion and struggle of the past 8 years. So David did what he had always done. He took a deep breath, maintained his dignity, and continued with his work. He pushed his cart toward the courtroom entrance, walking past Thompson and the crowd of onlookers with his head held high, but Thompson wasn't ready to let the moment pass. He was enjoying himself too much, and the crowd's attention was too intoxicating to give up. As David walked by, Thompson decided to deliver what he thought would be the perfect finishing blow to his impromptu comedy routine. "You know what I bet?" Thompson called out, his voice echoing through the marble hallway. "I bet this guy couldn't even spell the word justice if you gave him all day to try. Some people are just born to clean up after their betters, and there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone has their place in the world." The hallway fell completely silent. Even the people who had been chuckling at Thompson's earlier comments looked stunned by the cruelty of his words. David stopped walking and stood perfectly still for a moment, his hand gripping the handle of his cleaning cart so tightly that his knuckles went white. For just a second, David considered turning around and confronting Thompson right there in front of everyone. He imagined the satisfaction he would feel telling the officer exactly what he thought of his ignorant assumptions. He imagined revealing his true accomplishments and watching Thompson's smug expression crumble, but then David remembered something. His law school professors had taught him about the importance of timing and strategy. This wasn't the right moment, and this wasn't the right place. When the truth came out, it would be on David's terms, not as a reaction to some bully's taunts. So David continued walking into the courtroom, leaving Thompson and his audience behind in the hallway. He had work to do, and soon everyone would understand exactly what kind of man David Williams really was. Judge Patricia Hernandez had been presiding over cases in this courthouse for 12 years, and in all that time she had never witnessed such a blatant display of disrespect in her hallway. She had heard every word of Officer Thompson's cruel comments through the open courtroom doors, and the injustice of it made her blood boil. Judge Hernandez was not just any judge. She had grown up in a working-class family where her father cleaned office buildings at night, while her mother worked in a factory during the day. She knew what it felt like to be looked down upon because of the work you did to survive. She had fought her way through law school while working 3 jobs, and she had never forgotten where she came from. More importantly, Judge Hernandez knew exactly who David Williams was, though she had never let on during their brief interactions over the years. She had been watching his journey from a distance, admiring his dedication and persistence. She knew about his night classes, his perfect attendance record at work, and his reputation among the courthouse staff as a man of integrity and kindness. What the crowd in the hallway didn't know was that Judge Hernandez had been following David's progress through law school because her own daughter attended the same community college. Her daughter had mentioned David several times over the years, talking about the older man in her legal studies classes who asked thoughtful questions and helped other students understand difficult concepts. Judge Hernandez had also heard about David from the professors at the college. During a faculty dinner she had attended as a guest speaker, one professor had mentioned a remarkable student who worked 2 jobs while maintaining excellent grades. When the professor described David's work ethic and dedication, Judge Hernandez realized they were talking about the quiet janitor she saw every day at the courthouse. As the crowd began filtering back into the courtroom after the recess, Judge Hernandez made a decision that would change everything. She had originally planned to wait until after the current case was finished to acknowledge David's achievement, but Thompson's behavior had forced her hand. Some moments called for immediate action, and this was one of them. David had quietly entered the courtroom and begun emptying the trash bins near the back rows. He worked efficiently, trying to make himself invisible as people returned to their seats. He could still feel the sting of Thompson's words, but he pushed the hurt aside and focused on completing his tasks. Thompson swaggered back into the courtroom with his group of fellow officers, still chuckling about his performance in the hallway. He felt proud of himself for putting the janitor in his place and establishing his own superiority in front of so many important people. He had no idea that his moment of glory was about to become his greatest humiliation. Judge Hernandez called the court to order and asked everyone to take their seats. She looked around the packed courtroom, taking note of all the reporters, lawyers, and spectators who had witnessed or heard about the incident in the hallway. She could see David in the back corner, quietly going about his work with the same dignity he had shown for 15 years. Before we continue with today's proceedings, Judge Hernandez announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I need to address something that just occurred in the hallway outside this courtroom." The crowd stirred with curiosity. It was unusual for a judge to interrupt a major trial to discuss something that had happened outside the courtroom. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering if someone had complained about his comments. He told himself that he had done nothing wrong and had every right to speak his mind. "I heard some very troubling comments made about one of our courthouse employees," Judge Hernandez continued, her tone serious and measured. "Comments that were not only disrespectful but also revealed a disturbing level of ignorance and prejudice." David stopped what he was doing and looked up at the judge, surprised that she was addressing the incident. He had expected to finish his work and leave quietly, hoping the whole embarrassing situation would be forgotten by tomorrow. He never imagined that Judge Hernandez had heard what happened or that she would bring it up in open court. The person who made these comments assumed they knew everything about someone based solely on the work that person does to earn a living, Judge Hernandez said, her eyes scanning the courtroom until they found Thompson. These assumptions were not only wrong but also deeply offensive to the principles of respect and dignity that should guide us all, especially in a house of justice. Thompson's face began to redden as he realized the judge was talking about him. He looked around nervously, noticing that several people in the courtroom were staring at him. He tried to maintain his composure, but he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "I want everyone in this courtroom to understand something very important," Judge Hernandez continued. "The work a person does to support themselves and their family should never be a source of shame or ridicule. Every honest job has dignity, and every person deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their occupation." David felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Judge Hernandez defend not just him, but everyone who had ever been looked down upon because of their work. He had never expected anyone in a position of power to stand up for him so publicly and so forcefully. "Furthermore," Judge Hernandez said, her voice growing stronger, "the assumptions made about this employee's intelligence and capabilities were not only cruel but also completely wrong. And I think it's time that everyone in this courtroom learned the truth about who this man really is." The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen to what the judge was saying. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to see where this was going. Judge Hernandez looked directly at David, who was still standing in the back corner with his cleaning supplies. "Mr. Williams," she said clearly, "would you please approach the bench?" David's heart began racing as every eye in the courtroom turned to look at him. He had never been asked to approach the bench before, and he wasn't sure what was happening. He set down his cleaning supplies and walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. Thompson watched in confusion as the janitor walked past him toward the judge's bench. He couldn't understand why Judge Hernandez was making such a big deal about a few harmless comments. In his mind, he had simply stated the obvious truth about a person's place in the world. When David reached the front of the courtroom, "Judge," Hernandez smiled at him warmly. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks, ever since she had heard through the college grapevine that David had taken his bar exam. She had planned to congratulate him privately, but Thompson's behavior had given her the perfect opportunity to do something much more meaningful. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hernandez said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom sound system, "would you please state your full name for the record?" David was confused by the request, but he answered clearly and respectfully. "David Michael Williams, Your Honor." "And how long have you been employed here at the courthouse, Mr. Williams?" 15 years, Your Honor. I started working here when I was 30 years old." Judge Hernandez nodded and continued her questioning. "And during these 15 years, what has your work schedule been like?" David wasn't sure where this was going, but he answered honestly. "I work here from 5:30 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, Your Honor. Then I work at another cleaning job until 10 at night." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. People were beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary, though they weren't sure what it was yet. "And what do you do after 10 at night, Mr. Williams?" Judge Hernandez asked, though she already knew the answer. David hesitated for a moment, then answered quietly. 3 nights a week I attend classes at the community college, Your Honor. Murmur went through the courtroom as people began to understand that there was much more to David's story than they had assumed. Thompson felt a growing sense of unease as he watched the exchange between the judge and the janitor. Judge Hernandez paused for a moment, looking out at the packed courtroom. She could see the curiosity and confusion on people's faces as they tried to understand why she was questioning the janitor in the middle of a major trial. The reporters in the front rows had their pens ready. Sensing that something newsworthy was about to happen, Thompson sat rigidly in his seat, his earlier confidence completely gone. He was starting to realize that this wasn't going to end well for him, though he still couldn't imagine what the judge was building up to. In his mind, David was just a janitor who had been lucky enough to get some night school classes. Nothing could change the basic facts about who was important and who wasn't. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hernandez continued, her voice filled with warmth and respect, "you mentioned that you attend classes 3 nights a week. How long have you been doing this?" David shifted slightly, still not sure why the judge was asking these questions in front of everyone. 8 years, Your Honor. I started taking classes when my daughter was 10 years old. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. 8 years of night school while working 2 jobs was impressive by anyone's standards. Some of the lawyers in the audience began to look at David with new interest, recognizing the dedication that kind of schedule would require. "And what have you been studying during these 8 years?" Judge Hernandez asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. David hesitated again. He had spent so many years keeping his educational goals private, partly because he didn't want to deal with people's skepticism or jokes. But standing here in front of all these people, with Judge Hernandez asking him directly, he decided it was time to tell the truth. "Law, Your Honor, I've been studying to become a lawyer." The murmur that went through the courtroom was louder this time. People turned to their neighbors, whispering in surprise. The idea that the courthouse janitor had been secretly studying law for 8 years was something none of them had expected. Thompson felt his stomach drop. This wasn't going where he had thought it would go. He looked around nervously, noticing that several people were now staring at him with expressions that weren't friendly. He tried to convince himself that going to some night school classes didn't make the janitor anything special, but he was starting to feel very uncomfortable. Judge Hernandez nodded approvingly at David's answer. "And have you completed your law degree, Mr. Williams?" "Yes, Your Honor. I graduated last month from the evening program at State University Law School." This time the reaction from the courtroom was much stronger. People began talking out loud, and Judge Hernandez had to call for order. The reporters were writing furiously, realizing they had stumbled onto an incredible human interest story. Several of the lawyers in the audience looked genuinely impressed, knowing how difficult it would be to complete law school while working full-time. But Judge Hernandez wasn't finished yet. She had saved the best part for last, and she could see that David was starting to understand what she was doing. His nervousness was being replaced by a quiet pride as he realized that his secret was finally coming out in the most public way possible. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hernandez said, her voice now carrying a tone of celebration, "I understand you recently took an important exam. Could you tell the court about that?" David's heart began to race as he realized what Judge Hernandez was about to reveal. He had been waiting for weeks to share this news with people, but he had planned to do it quietly, maybe with a few close friends and family members. He never imagined it would come out like this, in front of a packed courtroom full of lawyers, reporters, and the very people who had been looking down on him for years. "I took the state bar examination 5 weeks ago, Your Honor," David said, his voice growing stronger with each word. The courtroom fell completely silent again. Everyone knew what the bar exam was, and everyone understood the significance of what David was saying. This wasn't just about going to school or getting a degree. The bar exam was what separated real lawyers from everyone else. Judge Hernandez smiled broadly, clearly enjoying this moment as much as David was. And Mr. Williams, have you received the results of that examination? David looked out at the courtroom, full of people who had ignored him, dismissed him, and assumed they knew everything about him based on his job title. He thought about all the times he had been treated as invisible, all the condescending comments he had endured, all the years of being seen as nothing more than the man who emptied their trash and cleaned their floors. Thompson was staring at David with growing horror, finally beginning to understand where this was going. His face had gone completely pale, and he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. He wanted to disappear, to somehow undo the last hour, to take back every cruel word he had spoken in the hallway. Yes, Your Honor, I received the results yesterday, David said, his voice now filled with quiet pride. I passed the bar examination. I am now a licensed attorney in the state. The courtroom exploded. People jumped to their feet, some clapping, others just staring in amazement. The reporters were practically climbing over each other to get better positions to document this incredible moment. Several of the courthouse staff members who had worked alongside David for years began cheering and applauding. Judge Hernandez allowed the celebration to continue for a full minute before calling for order. She was beaming with pride, not just for David, but for the justice system itself. This was what America was supposed to be about, the opportunity for anyone to rise above their circumstances through hard work and determination. Thompson sat frozen in his chair, unable to move or speak. The man he had mocked and humiliated just an hour earlier was now revealed to be his equal, at least in terms of education and professional qualifications. The janitor he had assumed couldn't spell justice was now qualified to practice law. In the same courtrooms where Thompson testified, but Judge Hernandez still wasn't finished. She wanted to make sure that everyone in the courtroom understood the full significance of what they had just witnessed, and she wanted to drive home the lesson about the dangers of judging people based on appearances. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Hernandez announced to the courtroom, what you have just witnessed is a perfect example of why we should never make assumptions about people based on their current circumstances. Mr. Williams has spent the last 8 years pursuing his dream while working 2 jobs and supporting his family. He has shown more dedication, perseverance, and character than most people ever will. David stood there feeling overwhelmed by the moment. After 8 years of studying in secret, after countless nights of exhaustion and doubt, after years of being treated as invisible by the very people who were now applauding him, his truth was finally out in the open. Mr. Williams, Judge Hernandez continued, I want to personally congratulate you on this remarkable achievement. You have proven that with enough determination and hard work, any dream is possible. You should be extremely proud of what you have accomplished. David felt tears forming in his eyes as he looked out at the courtroom, full of people who were now seeing him in a completely different light. The transformation was almost magical in the space of just a few minutes. He had gone from being the invisible janitor to being the hero of an incredible story of triumph over adversity. Thompson, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that his moment of cruel entertainment was about to become the most embarrassing experience of his career. The man he had publicly humiliated was now revealed to be someone who had achieved something Thompson himself had never even attempted, and everyone in the courtroom had witnessed both his cruelty and his ignorance. Judge Hernandez looked out at the courtroom, which was still buzzing with excitement and amazement. She could see people turning to each other, sharing their shock and admiration for what David had accomplished. But she also knew that this moment was about more than just one man's success story. This was an opportunity to teach everyone present a valuable lesson about dignity, respect, and the dangers of prejudice. Mr. Williams, Judge Hernandez said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I think everyone here would benefit from hearing your thoughts about this experience. Would you be willing to share with the court what it has been like to pursue your education while working in this building? David looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. Just an hour ago, most of these people had either ignored him completely or looked right through him as if he didn't exist. Now they were hanging on his every word, waiting to hear what he had to say. The transformation was almost surreal. He thought about all the times he had imagined this moment during the long nights of studying. He had dreamed of the day when he could finally reveal his accomplishments to the people who had dismissed him. But now that the moment was here, he felt no anger or desire for revenge. Instead, he felt a deep sense of responsibility to use this opportunity to speak for everyone who had ever been underestimated or overlooked. "Your Honor," David began, his voice steady and clear, "I want to thank you for giving me this chance to speak. For the past 15 years, I have had the privilege of working in this building, watching the wheels of justice turn every single day. I have seen countless trials, heard thousands of arguments, and witnessed both the beauty and the flaws of our legal system." The courtroom was completely silent as David spoke. Even the reporters had stopped writing to listen to his words. There was something powerful about hearing from someone who had observed the legal system from such a unique perspective for so many years. "When I first started working here," David continued, "I was just grateful to have a job that could support my family. I took pride in keeping this building clean and making sure it was a place where justice could be served properly. But as the years went by, I began to notice things that troubled me." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering if David was about to call him out specifically for his behavior over the years. He could feel sweat forming under his collar as he realized that David had been watching and listening all these years, taking note of how people treated him and others. "I saw how differently people were treated based on their appearance, their job, or the color of their skin," David said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I watched wealthy defendants get treated with respect while poor defendants were dismissed or ignored. I saw police officers who bent the truth and lawyers who didn't care enough to fight for their clients." Several lawyers in the courtroom looked uncomfortable at this observation, knowing that David had probably witnessed some of their less proud moments over the years. The courthouse staff members nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth in what David was saying. "But I also saw incredible examples of justice being served," David continued. "I saw lawyers who fought tirelessly for their clients, judges who treated everyone with fairness and respect, and officers who truly believed in protecting and serving their communities. These positive examples inspired me to want to be part of the solution." Judge Hernandez smiled as she listened to David speak. She could see that his years of observation and study had given him a deep understanding of both the potential and the problems within the justice system. This wasn't just someone who had memorized law books. This was someone who truly understood what justice meant. "The decision to go to law school wasn't easy," David said, looking out at the faces in the courtroom. "My wife had to work extra shifts at the hospital to help pay for my books and tuition. My daughter had to do her homework alone many nights while I was at class. We sacrificed family time, vacations, and simple pleasures so that I could pursue this dream." The emotion in David's voice was unmistakable as he talked about his family sacrifices. Several people in the courtroom were visibly moved by his words, understanding for the first time the real cost of his achievement. "But we believed it was worth it," David continued, "because we knew that education was the one thing that no one could ever take away from us. We knew that if I could become a lawyer, I could help other families who were struggling, other people who felt like their voices weren't being heard." Thompson felt smaller and smaller as he listened to David speak. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything to better himself and help others. While Thompson had spent his career looking down on people and making himself feel superior by putting others down. "During my years of study, I often came to work tired from staying up late reading case law and writing papers," David said. "Sometimes I would fall asleep over my textbooks after working 16 hours straight. But every morning I would come back to this courthouse with renewed determination." David paused and looked directly at Thompson, who was staring at his hands and avoiding eye contact. "I heard the comments people made about my intelligence, my capabilities, my worth as a human being. I heard the jokes about janitors who thought they could be lawyers. I heard the assumptions about what someone like me could or couldn't achieve." The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Everyone knew that David was talking about more than just general comments. He was talking about the specific cruelty they had witnessed just an hour earlier. "But I never let those comments discourage me," David said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "Instead, I used them as motivation. Every time someone assumed I was stupid, I studied harder. Every time someone treated me as if I was invisible, I reminded myself that someday I would have a voice that couldn't be ignored." Several people in the courtroom began to tear up as they realized the incredible strength and determination it had taken for David to persevere through years of disrespect and discrimination. They began to understand that his achievement was about much more than just passing some tests. It was about overcoming a system that had tried to keep him down. "I want everyone here to understand something important," David said, his voice growing stronger. "The work I do as a janitor is honest work, and there is no shame in it. The people who clean your offices, serve your food, and take care of your buildings are not lesser human beings. They are people with dreams, families, and stories that you may never know unless you take the time to actually see them." The applause that erupted from the courtroom was spontaneous and thunderous. People jumped to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement at the wisdom and grace David had shown in the face of such treatment. Judge Hernandez allowed the applause to continue for several minutes before calling for order. She could see that David's words had touched everyone present, including some of the people who had probably never thought twice about how they treated service workers. "Mr. Williams," Judge Hernandez said when the courtroom had quieted down, "your words remind us all of the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. You have shown incredible grace under pressure, and your achievement serves as an inspiration to everyone who has ever been told they couldn't reach their dreams." David nodded gratefully at Judge Hernandez, feeling overwhelmed by the response to his words. After years of being invisible, after years of having his voice ignored, he had finally been heard. And the message he had delivered wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about hope, perseverance, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves. As the applause for David's speech finally died down, Judge Hernandez turned her attention to Officer Thompson, who was sitting rigidly in his chair looking like he wanted to disappear through the floor. His face had gone from red to pale too, a sickly green color as the reality of his situation became clear. The man he had publicly humiliated was not only his intellectual equal but had achieved something Thompson himself had never even attempted. Thompson could feel every eye in the courtroom on him now. The same people who had been his audience during his cruel performance in the hallway were now looking at him with expressions of disgust and disappointment. The younger officers who had laughed at his jokes earlier were now avoiding eye contact, clearly embarrassed to be associated with his behavior. "Officer Thompson," Judge Hernandez said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter, "I believe you have something you need to address." Thompson's mouth went dry as he realized he was being called out directly. He had spent his entire career hiding behind his badge and his authority, using his position to intimidate people who couldn't fight back. But now he was facing a federal judge in a packed courtroom, and there was nowhere to hide. "Your Honor," Thompson stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know... You didn't know what, Officer Thompson?" Judge Hernandez interrupted, her tone sharp. "You didn't know that Mr. Williams was an attorney? Or you didn't know that your comments were cruel and inappropriate regardless of Mr. Williams' educational background?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thompson realized that there was no good answer he could give. If he said he didn't know David was a lawyer, he would be admitting that he thought it was acceptable to mock and belittle someone based on their job. If he said he knew his comments were wrong regardless, he would be admitting that he had deliberately chosen to be cruel. Detective Rodriguez, Thompson's partner of 5 years, was sitting next to him and couldn't believe what he was witnessing. He had always known that Thompson had issues with treating people respectfully, but he had never seen him humiliate someone so publicly and thoroughly. Rodriguez was already thinking about how he could distance himself from Thompson's behavior when they returned to the station. "Officer Thompson," Judge Hernandez continued. In my 12 years on this bench, I have seen many examples of poor judgment and inappropriate behavior. But what I witnessed in the hallway today was particularly disturbing because it revealed a pattern of thinking that has no place in law enforcement. Thompson tried to speak up in his own defense, but Judge Hernandez held up her hand to stop him. She wasn't finished making her point, and she wanted everyone in the courtroom to understand the seriousness of what had happened. Law enforcement officers are supposed to serve and protect all members of our community, Judge Hernandez said, her voice growing stronger. They are supposed to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their job, or their social status. What you displayed today was the exact opposite of those values. Several of the other police officers in the courtroom were nodding in agreement with Judge Hernandez's words. They knew that Thompson's behavior reflected poorly on all of them, and they were angry that his actions might damage the reputation of officers who genuinely tried to serve their community with honor. Captain Williams from the police department was sitting in the back of the courtroom, having arrived just in time to witness David's speech and the judge's response to Thompson. He had been Thompson's supervisor for 3 years and had received multiple complaints about the officer's attitude and behavior. This public embarrassment was exactly what he had been afraid would happen if Thompson's conduct wasn't addressed. Furthermore, Judge Hernandez continued, your comments revealed a troubling ignorance about the value and dignity of honest work. Mr. Williams has been serving this courthouse faithfully for 15 years while pursuing his education and supporting his family. His dedication and character are beyond reproach. Thompson felt like he was shrinking in his chair as Judge Hernandez continued her critique. He had always prided himself on being tough and not letting people push him around, but now he felt completely powerless and exposed. The authority and confidence he usually projected had evaporated completely. I am particularly troubled by your assumption that you could judge someone's intelligence and worth based on their occupation, Judge Hernandez said. This kind of prejudice has no place in our justice system, and it certainly has no place in the behavior of law enforcement officers. David stood quietly near the judge's bench, watching as Thompson received the public accountability that had been long overdue. He felt no satisfaction or joy in seeing the officer's humiliation, only a sense that justice was finally being served. David understood that this moment was about more than just his personal vindication. It was about establishing that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. Attorney Johnson, one of the most respected lawyers in the courthouse, stood up from his seat in the gallery. He had worked in this building for 20 years and had witnessed Thompson's behavior toward house staff many times. He felt compelled to speak up about what he had observed over the years. Your Honor, Attorney Johnson said, if I may be permitted to address the court. I believe there are others who have witnessed similar behavior from Officer Thompson over the years. Judge Hernandez nodded for him to continue. She could see that this was turning into something much bigger than just one incident, and she wanted to make sure all the facts came to light. I have personally observed Officer Thompson making disparaging comments about courthouse staff, witnesses, and defendants on multiple occasions, Attorney Johnson said. His behavior toward Mr. Williams today was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of disrespectful conduct. Other lawyers in the courtroom began nodding in agreement. Attorney Davis, who specialized in civil rights cases, stood up next. Your Honor, I have also witnessed similar behavior. Officer Thompson seems to believe that his badge gives him the right to treat certain people as if they are beneath him. Thompson could feel the walls closing in around him as more and more people spoke up about his behavior. He realized that his moment of cruel entertainment had opened the floodgates for years of accumulated complaints and observations. People who had previously stayed silent were now feeling empowered to speak up. Court reporter Stevens, who had been working in the courthouse for 12 years, raised her hand to speak. Your Honor, I have heard Officer Thompson make inappropriate comments about defendants based on their race and economic status. His behavior has made many of us uncomfortable for years. Bailiff Martinez, who had worked alongside David for over a decade, stood up as well. Your Honor, Mr. Williams is one of the most respectful and hardworking people I have ever known. Officer Thompson's treatment of him today was completely unacceptable, but it's also typical of how he treats anyone he considers beneath his status. Judge Hernandez listened to each person who spoke up, taking notes and nodding grimly. She realized that Thompson's behavior was an even bigger problem than she had initially thought. This wasn't just about one cruel comment. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been poisoning the atmosphere of the courthouse for years. Thompson sat in stunned silence as person after person stood up to describe his behavior. He had always assumed that his treatment of others went unnoticed or that people accepted it as normal. He never realized that so many people had been watching and disapproving of his conduct all along. Captain Williams finally stood up from the back of the courtroom. As Thompson's supervisor, he knew he had to address the situation before it got any worse for the department. Your Honor, Captain Williams said, I want to assure the court that the police department takes these allegations very seriously, officer. Thompson will face a full internal investigation and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. Judge Hernandez looked at Captain Williams with a serious expression as he finished speaking. She appreciated that he was taking responsibility for his officer's conduct, but she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to address the damage that had been done. The courthouse was a place where justice was supposed to prevail, and Thompson's behavior had violated the very principles that the building represented. Captain Williams, Judge Hernandez said firmly, while I appreciate your assurance that this matter will be investigated, I cannot allow Officer Thompson to continue testifying in my courtroom while these serious allegations are being reviewed. Effective immediately, Officer Thompson's testimony privileges in this courthouse are suspended pending a full investigation. Thompson's face went completely white as he realized what Judge Hernandez had just said. Being banned from testifying in court was essentially being banned from doing a major part of his job. Without the ability to testify about his arrests and investigations, he would be useless to the police department for any serious cases. The suspension meant that all of Thompson's pending cases would have to be reassigned to other officers. Defense attorneys would have grounds to challenge any convictions that relied on his testimony. His career was effectively over unless he could somehow repair the damage he had done to his reputation and credibility. Captain Williams nodded grimly at Judge Hernandez's decision. He knew it was the right call, even though it would create significant problems for the department. Thompson had been involved in dozens of ongoing cases, and now they would have to figure out how to proceed without his testimony. Furthermore, Judge Hernandez continued, I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding Officer Thompson's conduct. Law enforcement officers who testify in court are held to high standards of credibility and character, and today's behavior falls far short of those standards. Thompson slumped in his chair as the full weight of his situation hit him. A complaint to the State Bar Association could affect his ability to testify in any courtroom in the state, not just Judge Hernandez's. His moment of cruel entertainment was turning into a career-ending disaster. Detective Rodriguez, sitting next to Thompson, was already thinking about how to distance himself from his partner's behavior. He had built a good reputation over his 15-year career, and he wasn't about to let Thompson's prejudice and stupidity damage his own standing in the department. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening in another part of the courtroom. Attorney Helen Mitchell, the president of the local bar association, had been sitting in the gallery observing the fraud trial when the incident with David began. She had listened to everything that transpired, and she was deeply moved by David's story and his graceful response to Thompson's cruelty. Attorney Mitchell stood up and approached the bench where David was still standing. She had been thinking about her law firm's recent discussions about diversity and inclusion, and David's story had given her an idea that could benefit everyone involved. Your Honor, Attorney Mitchell said, if I may address Mr. Williams directly? Judge Hernandez nodded. Curious to see what the Bar Association president had to say, Attorney Mitchell turned to David with a warm smile. Mr. Williams, my name is Helen Mitchell, and I'm the president of the County Bar Association. I want to personally congratulate you on your incredible achievement. Passing the bar exam while working 2 jobs and supporting a family is truly remarkable. David thanked her politely, still somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention he was receiving. He had gone from being invisible to being the center of attention in the span of an hour, and he was still trying to process everything that was happening. Mr. Williams, Attorney Mitchell continued, my law firm specializes in civil rights and employment law, and we've been looking for talented attorneys who understand the challenges faced by working-class people and minorities. Would you be interested in discussing a position with our firm? The courtroom buzzed with excitement as people realized they were witnessing something incredible. Not only had David's true qualifications been revealed, but now he was being offered a job at one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. David felt his heart racing as he tried to process what Attorney Mitchell was saying. He had been planning to start his legal career slowly, maybe with a small firm or a public defender's office. The idea of working with a major civil rights firm was beyond his wildest dreams. I would be very honored to discuss that opportunity with you, David replied, his voice filled with emotion. Civil rights law is exactly the field I hope to enter. Attorney Mitchell smiled broadly. Excellent. I think your unique perspective and experience would be invaluable to our clients. Many of them are people who have been overlooked or underestimated by the system, just as you were. Who better to represent them than someone who truly understands their struggles? The reporters in the courtroom were writing furiously, realizing that this story was getting better by the minute. What had started as a routine fraud trial had turned into an incredible tale of triumph over adversity, complete with a happy ending that seemed too good to be true. Judge Hernandez watched the exchange between David and Attorney Mitchell with great satisfaction. She had hoped that David's story would inspire people, but she hadn't expected such an immediate and concrete result. Seeing him get offered a position at a prestigious firm was the perfect conclusion to an already remarkable day. But the consequences for Thompson were just beginning. Captain Williams approached him during a brief recess and spoke to him in low, urgent tones. The captain explained that Thompson would be placed on administrative leave effective immediately while the department conducted a full investigation into his conduct. 20 years of service, Captain Williams said quietly, and you're going to throw it all away because you couldn't keep your mouth shut and treat people with basic respect. Thompson tried to explain himself, but Captain Williams cut him off. There's nothing you can say that will make this better. Your behavior today was recorded by court reporters, witnessed by dozens of people, and it's probably going to be in every newspaper in the state tomorrow. Indeed, the reporters were already calling their editors to alert them about the incredible story they had just witnessed. The courthouse janitor who became a Lauer was exactly the kind of human interest story that readers loved, especially when it included a villain getting his comeuppance. Channel 7 news reporter Jennifer Chung was already planning how she would structure her evening news segment. This story had everything: an underdog hero, a racist villain, a dramatic revelation, and a happy ending. It was the kind of story that could go viral on social media and inspire people across the country. Meanwhile, David was surrounded by well-wishers from the courthouse staff. People who had worked alongside him for years were congratulating him and expressing their amazement at his achievement. Many of them admitted that they had no idea he was pursuing his education, and they were inspired by his dedication and perseverance. Bailiff Martinez shook David's hand warmly. Man, I've worked with you for 10 years, and I had no idea you were studying law. You should have told us. We would have been cheering you on the whole time. David smiled at his colleague's enthusiasm. I didn't want to make a big deal about it until I knew for sure I could make it. There were plenty of times when I wasn't sure I'd be able to finish. Court Clerk Thompson, no relation to Officer Thompson, had tears in her eyes as she congratulated David. You've inspired all of us, she said. If you can achieve your dreams while working 2 jobs and dealing with all the disrespect you faced, then maybe the rest of us can pursue our dreams too. As word spread throughout the courthouse, more and more people came to congratulate David and hear his story firsthand. The maintenance staff, the security guards, the court reporters, everyone wanted to shake hands with the man who had proven that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when David's wife, Patricia, arrived at the courthouse. Someone had called her at the hospital where she worked to tell her what was happening. She rushed over during her lunch break and arrived just in time to see her husband being congratulated by dozens of people. When David saw his wife enter the courtroom, he broke away from the crowd and embraced her. They both had tears in their eyes as they realized that their years of sacrifice had finally paid off in ways they never could have imagined. 3 weeks later, David Williams walked through the same courthouse doors he had entered thousands of times before, but everything was different now. Instead of his familiar janitor's uniform and cleaning cart, he wore a crisp navy blue suit and carried a leather briefcase. The transformation was so complete that some people didn't recognize him at first. The story of what happened in Judge Hernandez's courtroom had spread far beyond the local courthouse. News outlets across the country had picked up the story of the janitor who became a lawyer and the racist officer who got his comeuppance. David had been interviewed on 3 television shows and featured in 2 major newspapers, but the real changes went much deeper than just media attention. David's story had inspired conversations about respect, dignity, and the importance of treating all people fairly regardless of their job or background. Schools were using his story to teach students about perseverance and the dangers of judging people by their appearances. On his first day at Mitchell, Rodriguez and Associates, David was nervous but excited. The law firm specialized in civil rights cases, employment discrimination, and helping working-class people fight for their rights. It was exactly the kind of work David had dreamed of doing during all those long nights of studying. Attorney Mitchell had been true to her word, offering David a position as a junior associate with a starting salary that was more than double what he had been making as a janitor. More importantly, she had promised him the opportunity to work on cases that mattered to him personally, cases involving workplace discrimination, educational access, and protecting the rights of people who often had no voice in the system. David's first case was representing a group of hospital cleaning staff who were being mistreated by their supervisors. The irony wasn't lost on him that his legal career was beginning by defending people doing the same kind of work he had been doing just weeks earlier. He understood their struggles in a way that few lawyers could. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson's life had taken a very different direction. The internal investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior going back years. Multiple complaints had been filed against him by citizens, courthouse staff, and even fellow officers. The investigation revealed that Thompson had been treating people differently based on their race, economic status, and occupation for most of his career. Thompson was ultimately fired from the police department after 20 years of service. The decision was made easier by the fact that several defense attorneys had already filed motions to have their clients' convictions overturned based on Thompson's credibility issues. The district attorney's office realized that Thompson had become a liability who could no longer effectively testify in court, but Thompson's story didn't end with his firing. The public humiliation and loss of his career had forced him to confront his own prejudices and behavior in a way he had never done before. His wife had threatened to leave him unless he got help for his anger and discrimination issues, and his own children had expressed shame about his actions. Thompson enrolled in anger management classes and cultural sensitivity training. It was a long and difficult process, but slowly he began to understand how his behavior had hurt not only other people but also himself and his family. He would never get his police career back, but he was determined to become a better person. The courthouse itself had implemented new policies as a direct result of what happened that day. Judge Hernandez had worked with courthouse administration to establish a formal process for reporting discrimination and harassment. All employees, from judges to maintenance staff, were required to attend training sessions on respect and workplace dignity. A special committee was formed to review how courthouse staff were treated and to ensure that everyone, regardless of their job title, was shown appropriate respect. The committee included representatives from every level of courthouse employment, from judges and lawyers down to security guards and cleaning staff. David's daughter, Angela, had been following her father's story with pride and amazement. She was a senior in high school now, and her father's achievement had inspired her to apply to pre-law programs at several universities. She wanted to follow in his footsteps and become a civil rights lawyer herself. "Dad," she told him one evening over dinner, "watching you achieve your dream has shown me that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it. You didn't just change your own life, you changed mine too." David's wife, Patricia, had been promoted to head nurse at the hospital where she worked. Her colleagues were amazed by the sacrifices she had made to support her husband's education, and her story had inspired other families to pursue their own dreams of advancement and education. The local community college where David had taken his classes established the David Williams Scholarship for working adults pursuing higher education. The scholarship was funded by donations from people who had been inspired by David's story, and it provided financial assistance to people who were trying to improve their lives while supporting their families. Judge Hernandez had been following David's progress at his new law firm with great interest. She had always believed in the power of education and hard work to transform lives, and David's story validated everything she believed about the American dream and the possibility of second chances. 6 months after that fateful day in the courtroom, Judge Hernandez invited David to speak at a judicial conference about his experiences observing the legal system from a unique perspective. His presentation was so well received that he began getting invitations to speak at law schools and bar association meetings across the state. David's story had a particularly powerful impact on young lawyers who were just starting their careers. Many of them had come from privileged backgrounds and had never considered how the legal system looked to people who were struggling economically or facing discrimination. David's perspective helped them understand the real-world impact of their work. The original fraud case that had been interrupted by David's revelation eventually concluded with guilty verdicts for all the defendants. But most people who had been in the courtroom that day remembered it not for the fraud trial, but for the incredible moment when David's true identity was revealed. Detective Rodriguez, Thompson's former partner, had been assigned a new partner and was working to rebuild his own reputation. He had testified against Thompson during the internal investigation, providing evidence of his former partner's discriminatory behavior. Rodriguez was determined to prove that not all police officers shared Thompson's prejudices. The courthouse cleaning staff had organized a celebration dinner for David at a local restaurant. It was an emotional evening as David's former colleagues toasted his success and shared their own stories of dreams and aspirations. Several of them had been inspired by David's example to pursue their own educational goals. As David sat at that dinner, surrounded by people who had worked alongside him for years, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Thompson had tried to humiliate him in front of everyone. The cruel comments that were meant to tear him down had instead lifted him up and created opportunities he never could have imagined. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how people treated each other at the courthouse. The cleaning staff reported that they were being shown more respect by lawyers, judges, and court personnel. People were making an effort to learn their names, say good morning, and treat them as valued members of the courthouse community. David often returned to the courthouse for cases, and each time he walked through those familiar hallways, he was reminded of how far he had come. But he never forgot the lessons of humility and hard work that had gotten him there. He made it a point to speak respectfully to every courthouse employee. From the newest security guard to the most senior judge, the story of David Williams became more than just a news story. It became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they couldn't achieve their dreams. It proved that with determination, family support, and unwavering faith in yourself, it was possible to overcome any obstacle and transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you.